Dorothy Jane Scott, the voice on the line. The phone calls began like whispers. Some nights, the man told her he loved her. Other nights, he promised to kill her. He described her clothes. He said he was watching her house. Sometimes he left roses on her car, like gifts from a ghost. And always his words carried the same terrifying truth. He knew where she was, and he was never far away. On the night of May 28, 1980, after helping a sick coworker at the hospital, Dorothy Jane Scott walked alone to the parking lot to bring her car around. Minutes later, her station wagon roared past her friends, headlights blinding, speed far too fast. Hours later, police found that car engulfed in flames in an alley in Santa Ana. But Dorothy was gone. And the phone calls, they didn't stop. Chapter 1. Who was Dorothy? Dorothy Jane Scott wasn't the type of person you'd expect to be the center of a chilling murder mystery. She was 32 years old, a single mother of a little boy named Sean, and someone her friends described as gentle, reliable, and almost painfully shy. She was born in April 1948 and grew up in Anaheim, California. Her parents, Jacob and Vera, were hardworking and deeply involved in her life. By 1980, Dorothy was living with her aunt in the nearby city of Stanton, while her parents helped her raise her 4-year-old son. For Dorothy, Sean was her world. She arranged her life around him. Her days revolved around work and parenting. Her parents were doting grandparents, and together they created a safety net that gave Dorothy space to provide while still being present in her son's life. Friends said Dorothy was not a woman drawn to risk. She was religious, conservative in her habits, and cautious by nature. She wasn't one for nightlife. She didn't drink or use drugs. She didn't have a busy dating life. In fact, most of the time she stayed home. Her father would later reflect that Dorothy preferred a quiet life, that she was a devout Christian, and that she had little interest in the distractions that pulled other people her age into trouble. By all accounts, Dorothy lived without enemies. She was known as kind, soft-spoken, and dependable. Her co-workers described her as someone who kept the stores running smoothly without drawing attention to herself. She worked as a secretary for 2 jointly owned shops in Anaheim, Swinger's Psych Shop, which sold novelties and alternative gifts, and Custom John's Head Shop, which catered to the counterculture crowd. To an outsider, those shops may have seemed a strange place for a conservative, church-going woman to spend her days. But Dorothy wasn't there for the lifestyle. She was there because she was trusted and needed. She worked the books, handled errands, and kept things steady. Her life was structured, routine, and rooted in family. She wasn't seeking excitement. She wasn't pushing boundaries, but someone was watching her. Chapter 2. The Stalker's Calls Begin. In the early months of 1980, Dorothy Jane Scott began receiving the phone calls that would soon dominate her life. At first, they came sporadically. A voice on the other end of the line, a man she did not recognize, speaking with a strange mixture of tenderness and menace. Some days he professed his love for her. He told her she was beautiful. He said he wanted to take care of her. His voice, she told her mother, sometimes sounded almost gentle, almost persuasive. But other days, that same voice would shift. It would harden into rage. And in those moments, he promised violence. One of the calls seared itself into her memory. He told her that he was going to get her alone, and when he did, he was going to cut her into pieces so small that no one would ever be able to find her. This was not a prank call. This was not a stranger dialing the wrong number. Dorothy soon realized that whoever this man was, he knew her. He described the clothes she was wearing on days when she had not seen him. He described where she had been, where she was driving. Once, when she left work late in the evening, she found a single dead rose laid carefully across the windshield of her car. The man was watching her. Dorothy was unsettled, but she tried to keep calm. She told her parents about the calls, and she told a few close friends. But this was 1980. Harassing phone calls were not treated with the seriousness they would be decades later. Stalking laws did not yet exist in California. To the authorities, unless the man physically harmed her, there was little to be done. Her parents urged her to be cautious. Dorothy, already a cautious woman, became more careful. She even began attending karate classes, hoping to be able to defend herself if the man ever came near. She briefly considered buying a handgun. The calls, however, did not stop. They escalated. They arrived at odd hours, in the morning, in the dead of night. Sometimes the caller said nothing. Sometimes he breathed heavily. Sometimes he whispered. At other times, he lashed out with words of violence. Through it all, Dorothy carried on with her life. She continued working at the shops. She continued raising Sean. To her friends and coworkers, she seemed quieter than usual, more watchful, but she rarely spoke openly about the calls beyond her immediate family. Her mother, Vera, would later say that Dorothy was frightened, but she did not want to live in fear. She wanted to protect her son and provide for him, and so she kept moving forward. But by the spring of 1980, Dorothy's sense of unease had hardened into something deeper. She began to believe that the caller was not going to stop until he made his threats real. And on the night of May 28, 1980, her worst fears came true. Chapter 3. The night of May 28, 1980. The day had started like any other. Dorothy worked at the shops, balancing her duties as secretary, keeping track of inventory, and helping customers. By the evening, she attended a staff meeting for employees of both stores. Among those present were her coworker, Pam Head, and another employee named Conrad Bostron. During the meeting, Conrad began to look unwell. His arm was swollen and red. Dorothy, always the caretaker, suggested that they drive him to the University of California Irvine Medical Center to have it checked. Pam and Conrad agreed, and so Dorothy drove them both. At the hospital, doctors determined that Conrad had likely suffered a spider bite. They treated him, and the group waited together for his discharge papers. It was late by the time he was released, close to 11 o'clock at night. Pam later recounted that Dorothy never left their side inside the hospital. She did not speak to anyone else. She did not disappear, not even for a moment. She spent the entire time sitting in the waiting room with her coworkers. As they prepared to leave, Dorothy offered to bring her car around to the entrance so that Conrad, still sore and tired, would not have to walk across the parking lot. Pam stayed with him while Dorothy headed out into the night toward her white 1973 Toyota station wagon. Minutes passed. Then headlights suddenly cut through the night. Pam and Conrad looked up to see Dorothy's car speeding toward them. The headlights were bright, blinding. They waved, but the car did not slow down. Instead, it swerved sharply and turned right out of the parking lot. Pam and Conrad were left confused. At first, they assumed Dorothy had gone to check on Sean, her son. Perhaps something urgent had come up. But as the minutes stretched into hours with no word from Dorothy, concern turned to fear. Around 4:30 in the morning, police in Santa Ana received reports of a burning car in an alleyway. When officers arrived, they found Dorothy's Toyota station wagon engulfed in flames in the 800 block of South Townsend. The fire was intense, but when it was extinguished, the vehicle was empty. There was no sign of Dorothy. She had vanished. Chapter 4. The calls continue. Family and media. Dorothy's parents were plunged into a nightmare. Their daughter was gone, her car torched, and no one knew where she was. In the days that followed, their phone rang constantly, friends checking in, neighbors offering condolences, police asking questions. But among those calls was another voice, a voice that chilled them to their core. About a week after Dorothy vanished, her mother answered the phone. On the other end was a man's voice, calm, cold. He said, "I've got her." Then he hung up. From that point forward, the calls continued. Always the same male voice, always the same mixture of taunting and cruelty. Some days he claimed he had Dorothy, other days he claimed he had killed her. Often, the calls came late at night when the house was quiet. Sometimes he called in the afternoons when Vera was home alone. The Scott family reported every detail to police. Investigators tried to trace the calls, but each time, the man hung up before the line could be tracked. The torment continued for years. Dorothy's parents lived with the agony of not knowing whether she was alive or dead, combined with the fresh wound of hearing her tormentor's voice again and again. On June 12, 1980, the Santa Ana Register published an article about Dorothy's disappearance. The story included details of the night she vanished, the burning car, and her family's desperate search for answers. That very same day, the newspaper's editorial desk received a call. A man on the line said, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The caller knew details about the night Dorothy disappeared that had not been made public. He mentioned Conrad's spider bite. He mentioned that Dorothy had changed a scarf she was wearing at the hospital. These details convinced police that the caller was indeed connected to her disappearance. The calls to Dorothy's family continued after that, stretching out not just for weeks or months, but for years. Nearly every Wednesday, Vera Scott would answer the phone, and that same voice would say just enough to remind her of what she had lost, then hang up before the call could be traced. For 4 years, the family lived in this limbo, without Dorothy, without a body, without closure, but with the constant reminder that someone out there still held the power to torment them. Chapter 5. The Long Years of Silence and Fear. For the Scott family, life after Dorothy's disappearance became a haunting routine. Each day carried the weight of uncertainty. Each night carried the threat of the phone ringing. Her parents, Jacob and Vera, never gave up hope, but they lived under a shadow. They raised Dorothy's son, Sean, doing their best to give him stability. But how could they explain to a child why his mother had vanished? How could they answer his questions when they had no answers of their own? The calls never stopped. Nearly every Wednesday afternoon, the phone would ring. Vera would pick it up, and that same voice would speak. Sometimes he said he loved Dorothy. Sometimes he said he had killed her. Other times he only asked, "Is Dorothy home?" before hanging up. The cruelty was relentless. Each call reopened the wound, reminding the family that their daughter was gone and that the person responsible was still out there. Police tried everything they could to trace the calls. At one point, they even had Vera keep the caller talking as long as possible, hoping the delay would give them time to identify his location. But the man was careful. He always hung up before the call could be tracked. The lack of progress left the family trapped. They had no body to bury, no evidence to pursue, and no closure to cling to. Through the years, they held on to faith. They clung to the hope that one day, Dorothy would walk through the door. That one day, the calls would stop because she had been found safe. But deep down, they knew the truth. The man on the phone had not lied when he said he had her. And as the years passed, hope turned slowly to resignation. Chapter 6. The Discovery of Dorothy's Remains. On August 6, 1984, more than 4 years after Dorothy vanished, construction workers in Anaheim Hills discovered skeletal remains while clearing land near Santa Ana Canyon Road. Alongside the remains of a human body were the bones of a dog. Among the personal items recovered was a turquoise ring and a wristwatch. The watch had stopped at 12:30 in the morning, just hours after Dorothy was last seen. The remains were sent for analysis, and dental records confirmed what the Scott family had feared all along. The remains belonged to Dorothy Jane Scott. The discovery shattered the last of the family's fragile hope. Dorothy had been dead for years. Her remains had been left in a remote area less than 15 minutes from where she had lived. The cause of death could not be determined. The bones were too decomposed, and no clear evidence of trauma could be identified. For investigators, this meant there were few new leads to pursue. For the family, it meant the cruel reality was finally confirmed. Dorothy was gone. In the weeks following the discovery, the phone calls that had plagued Vera for years finally stopped. The man who had tormented the family seemed to vanish with the news of Dorothy's remains being found. Whether it was coincidence or conscience, no one ever called the Scott home again. A memorial service was held later that month. Friends, family, and neighbors gathered to remember Dorothy's life and to support her parents, who had endured more than 4 years of unanswered questions. But though the service gave them a moment of closure, the truth remained unbearable. Dorothy had been stalked, abducted, and murdered, and her killer had never been caught. Chapter 7. The Theories. The discovery of Dorothy's remains in August of 1984 closed one chapter but opened another. Now the question was no longer where is she, but rather who killed her and why. Theories swirled among investigators, journalists, and members of the public. Some seemed plausible, others bordered on speculation. All shared one common truth: no one was ever brought to justice for Dorothy's murder. The first and most widely accepted theory was that the man who called Dorothy for months before her disappearance, and who called her family for years afterward, was indeed her killer. The consistency of the voice, the intimate knowledge of her life, and the timing of the calls all pointed to a single stalker who had grown increasingly obsessed. But who was he? The coworker, or customer theory. Because Dorothy worked in 2 shops that drew all sorts of people, investigators considered whether her stalker might have been a coworker, a customer, or someone connected to the stores. Both Swinger's Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop attracted a mix of counterculture patrons, and it was possible that Dorothy caught the attention of a man who mistook her kindness for romantic interest. This theory gained some traction because the caller knew personal details about Dorothy's clothing and her actions on the night she disappeared, information that could have been observed by someone in her circle. But no coworker or customer was ever conclusively linked to the crime. The jealous suitor theory. The caller once claimed to the Santa Ana Register that Dorothy was cheating on him with another man. He called her his love and insisted he killed her in a fit of jealous rage. Yet Dorothy was not known to be dating anyone at the time. Friends and family insisted she had no romantic relationships, and her life revolved around her son. This led some to believe that the caller's perception of Dorothy was entirely delusional. He may have constructed a fantasy in which she belonged to him, and when she failed to respond to his imagined affection, he convinced himself she was being unfaithful. In his mind, this betrayal justified violence. The serial killer theory. Some speculated that Dorothy might have been targeted by a serial offender operating in Southern California at the time. The early 1980s were marked by a number of active killers in the region, including the likes of the freeway killer, William Bonin, and others. However, none of their confirmed crimes matched Dorothy's case. Her abduction from a hospital parking lot and the years of phone harassment pointed more strongly to a personal obsession rather than a random predator. Still, without DNA evidence or a confession, the possibility of a wider pattern could not be entirely dismissed. The dog remains. When Dorothy's body was discovered, the skeletal remains of a dog were found nearby. To some, this suggested a chilling ritualistic aspect to the crime, as though the killer had staged the site. To others, it was merely a coincidence, a case of a stray animal that had died in the same area. The truth has never been clarified, and the presence of the dog remains only deepened the sense of mystery. The traced call. At one point, police believed they had a lead when they managed to trace one of the calls to a man's workplace. Investigators questioned him, but he denied involvement, and there was not enough evidence to hold him. The man was released, and the case once again grew cold. Whether that man truly was the caller remains unknown. If he was innocent, then the real killer remained at large. If he was guilty, then a dangerous stalker slipped through the cracks of justice. In the end, every theory circles back to the same haunting reality. Dorothy was stalked by a man who believed he had a claim to her life. He took her, he killed her, and he mocked her family for years. But his identity was never proven, and his face was never unmasked. Chapter 8: Legacy and Reflection. The murder of Dorothy Jane Scott remains one of the most chilling unsolved cases in California history. It is a story not just of violence, but of obsession, of a woman whose quiet life was shattered by someone who refused to let her live in peace. Her parents endured unimaginable torment. For 4 years, they raised Sean while answering the phone to a man who relished their suffering. The calls ended only after her remains were discovered. By then, their daughter had been gone for years. For Sean, the loss was permanent. He grew up without his mother, raised by his grandparents. In later life, he spoke openly about the void her death left in his life. Tragically, he himself passed away in 2002, never having learned the truth about what happened to her. The case also highlights the gaps in the law at the time. In 1980, there were no legal protections specifically addressing stalking. Harassing phone calls were treated as nuisances rather than as warning signs of escalating violence. It was not until 1990, after the high-profile murder of actress Rebecca Schaeffer by a stalker, that California enacted the nation's first anti-stalking law. By then, Dorothy's case had long gone cold. For those who study crime, her case stands as a stark reminder of how dangerous obsession can be and how society once failed to recognize the signs. Even today, more than 4 decades later, her murder remains unsolved. The voice on the line has never been identified. The man who claimed to love her, who claimed to kill her, remains a phantom in the shadows of history. And yet, Dorothy's story endures. True crime communities, journalists, and advocates continue to tell her story, hoping that one day, new evidence may emerge, or someone may come forward with information that finally brings answers. Dorothy Jane Scott's life was not one of danger or recklessness. She was a devoted mother, a caring daughter, a quiet soul who wanted nothing more than to raise her son and live in peace. But her story is a chilling reminder that danger can find anyone, and that obsession, once ignited, can burn lives to the ground. Dorothy's story begins with a voice on the line and ends with a silence that is almost worse. For years, her family lived with that voice, haunting them through their telephone. When her remains were found, the voice fell quiet. But silence does not equal justice. To this day, Dorothy Jane Scott's killer has never been named. He has never been tried. He has never paid for what he did. Her story leaves us with questions that may never be answered. Who was the man who called her? How did he know her every move? Why did he choose Dorothy? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many times have we passed someone like him on the street, never knowing the darkness they carried within?